ASEAN is situated between two major economies, China and India, which are collaborators and competitors to the region. And ASEAN is situated within the old and new international trade routes, namely the old maritime Silk Road, which covered trade between the Middle East, China, Korea and Japan, and the South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca and the Straits of Singapore, three of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. South China Sea is an important area for trade routes and beginning from the 19th century as a source of energy with the discovery of oil and gas. ASEAN was formed on the 8th of August 1967 by the original 5 members comprising Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore and Thailand. ASEAN has since expanded to cover most of Southeast Asian nations including Brunei, Cambodia, Laos PDR, Myanmar and Vietnam. ASEAN is unlike any other initiatives for regional integration. Although they serve the same purpose, that is to ensure peaceful coexistence of nations. Compared with the EU, for example, ASEAN started as a peaceful organization, whereas the EU started as the European Economic Community under the Treaty of Rome 1957. Since then, ASEAN's development can be taken into 5 different groups. Between 1967 and 1976, with its establishment, ASEAN developed solidarity within nations and dialogue partners. Within 1977 and 1997, ASEAN expanded to include Brunei, Vietnam, Laos PDR, Myanmar and Cambodia. And then in 1998 to 2007, ASEAN leads to the formalization of the organization through the ASEAN Charter. Between 2008 and 2015, ASEAN was involved in community building, leading to the ASEAN Community in 2015. Between 2016 and 2025, ASEAN worked on the ASEAN Vision 2025, Forging Ahead Together. ASEAN is a large market with about 50% of them are of the working age of 20 to 54 years old and about 49% live in the urban areas. The ASEAN economic performance, despite the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, has exceeded many predictions and expectations. When ASEAN embarked on the ASEAN Vision 2020 in 1997, the ASEAN's GDP was at $954 billion. ASEAN became a $1 trillion economy in 2006, 1 year later than the predicted date. But ASEAN passed the $2 trillion trade benchmark in 2011, 9 years earlier than the anticipated date of 2020. According to the International Monetary Fund, by 2025, ASEAN would almost reach $3 trillion point and will be closer to $4 trillion in 2020. In 2020, based on the ASEAN Blueprint Midterm Review, ASEAN GDP has grown by more than 5% on average for the past 5 years to reach 3.2 trillion in 2019. However, the GDP for 2020 contracted to $3 trillion due to the COVID-19 pandemic. ASEAN collectively is the 5th largest economy in the world, accounting to 3.6% of the global economy in nominal term, or 6.2% in the purchasing power parity. ASEAN GDP per capita has consistently grown in the last 5 years from around $3,900 to more than $4,800. In turning ASEAN into a single production base connected to the world through Global ASEAN, under the ASEAN Vision 2025 Forging Ahead Together, ASEAN member states are involved in 3 levels of economic diplomacy to discuss, negotiate and implement ASEAN economic agreements, their protocols and other related decisions. The first level is bilateral economic agreements between ASEAN member states, such as the recently concluded Singapore-Indonesia Bilateral Investment Treaty in 2018 and came into force in 2021. The second level is where ASEAN member states form to represent their collective interests in the International Economic Organizations or Agreement. Examples include the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation or APEC, the CPTPP, and the World Trade Organization WTO. Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam are all parties to the CPTPP, which does not involve all other ASEAN member states. 7 of the ASEAN member states, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam are also member economies of APEC, and all 10 ASEAN member states are also members of the World Trade Organization. The third level is where all ASEAN member states will have to practice economic diplomacy with ASEAN dialogue partners in order to achieve mutual economic benefits. ASEAN has developed friendly relations and mutually beneficial dialogues and relationships with several countries and regional groupings, which are known as ASEAN dialogue partners. They include Australia, Canada, China, European Union, India, Japan, Pakistan, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States. ASEAN has negotiated and agreed major economic agreements with its dialogue partners, especially with the signing of the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership Agreements, or the RCEP. The RCEP agreements consolidate the earlier preferential trade agreements between ASEAN and China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. ASEAN also commenced a preferential trade agreement negotiation with the EU, which was later suspended and took a bilateral route over the Myanmar issue. ASEAN is also negotiating with the European Free Trade Area countries and has commenced talk for an free trade agreement with Canada. An important element of ASEAN's culture and decision-making process is the ASEAN Way, which is an informal nature of decision-making process through consensus building. ASEAN outward-looking and inclusive strategy, moving away from protectionist and inward-looking policies, not only contributed to the region's growth, but also underpinned its political security, such as in addressing South China Sea issue. ASEAN to continue on its path of inclusive growth, no longer be a support player, but rather a leader, whilst taking proactive steps to avoid domestic oppositions to its liberalization and reform initiatives. ASEAN as an international grouping of nations have developed from a mere loose organization under the Bangkok Declaration, or generally known as ASEAN Declaration, into a more structured organization through various initiatives such as the Bali Concord 1, 2 and 3, and the ASEAN Charter. As stated in the ASEAN Declaration, among the aims and objectives of ASEAN is to accelerate economic growth, social progress, and cultural development in the region in order to strengthen the foundation for a prosperous community of Southeast Asian nations. ASEAN's first step towards regional integration started with the signing of Bali Concord 2, which was endorsed at the 9th ASEAN Summit in October 2003. Bali Concord 2 consists of 3 pillars, namely the ASEAN Security Community, now known as the ASEAN Political Security Community, the ASEAN Economic Community, and the ASEAN Social Cultural Community. Bali Concord 2 is followed by Bali Concord 3 with the theme of ASEAN Community in a global community of nations. Bali Concord 3 covers all main pillars of ASEAN, namely political security cooperation, economic cooperation, and social cultural cooperation. Bali Concord 3 promotes economic integration, which is to enhance ASEAN's effective participation in regional and economic integration, impacting on the region. Promote economic stability in strengthening macroeconomic coordination and promoting financial cooperation at the regional and global level. And to promote economic development, which is to strengthen cooperation with relevant international organizations in promoting higher level of economic dynamism, sustained prosperity, and inclusive growth. Under the political security cooperation, Bali Concord 3, ASEAN adopts, among others, the principles of independence, sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, non-interference, and national identity of all nations. ASEAN also adopts the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and renounces aggression and the threat or use of force or other actions in any manner inconsistent with international law. Consistent with the purposes and principles of ASEAN, basic instruments to ensure that peoples and member states of ASEAN live in peace with the world at large in a just, democratic, and harmonious environment. ASEAN also adopts adherence to the rule of law, good governance, the principle of democracy, and constitutional government, promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as promotion of social justice. Under the economic cooperation, Bali Concord 3 promotes a region fully integrated into the global economy. ASEAN looks inter alia, enhance ASEAN's effective participation in regional and economic initiatives impacting on the region. Advance ASEAN economic relations, in particular trade and investment, within the region as well with the rest of the world in line with the general principles set out in the ASEAN Framework for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. To strengthen ASEAN's capacity in becoming a more dynamic and stronger segment of the global supply chain, continue the adoption of international best practices and standards in production and distribution, where possible, to intensify collaboration and adopt common position on issues of mutual interest in regional and international fora. The transformation of ASEAN from a loose organization into a legal entity is enhanced by the signing of the ASEAN Charter. The ASEAN Charter was signed by the 10 heads of the ASEAN member states at the 13th ASEAN Summit in Singapore on the 20th November 2007. The first steps to the ASEAN Charter was taken after the Bali Concord 2 in 2003, and this was followed by an announcement in the Vientiane Action Plan at the 10th ASEAN Summit in 2004. Here, ASEAN leaders declared that they will actively work towards the ASEAN Charter. In the 11th ASEAN Summit in 2005, ASEAN leaders signed the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on the establishment of the ASEAN Charter and agreed to the formation of an Eminent Persons Group. At the 12th ASEAN Summit in January 2007, the report of the Eminent Persons Group on ASEAN Charter was presented to the ASEAN leaders, which became the basis for the ASEAN Charter. At the 12th ASEAN Summit, ASEAN leaders issued the Cebu Declaration on the blueprint of the ASEAN Charter to endorse the EPG report, and they directed the high-level task force to complete the drafting of the ASEAN Charter in time for the 13th Summit in Singapore in 2007. The ASEAN Charter came into force on the 15th of December 2008 when all ASEAN member states ratified the Charter. The ASEAN Charter provides ASEAN a legal personality and makes it into an international governmental organization. This makes ASEAN as a rule-based and people-oriented international organization. Under the ASEAN Charter, the main purposes of ASEAN are to maintain and enhance peace, security and stability, and further strengthen peace-oriented values in the region. To enhance regional resilience by promoting greater political, security, economic, and social-cultural cooperation. To preserve Southeast Asia as a nuclear weapon-free zone and to free of all other weapons of mass destruction. To ensure that the people, member states of ASEAN, live in peace with the world at large in a just, democratic, and harmonious environment. On the economic purposes of ASEAN, the ASEAN Charter states that ASEAN aims to create a single market and production base, which is stable, prosperous, highly competitive, and economically integrated, with effective facilitation for trade and investment, in which there is a free flow of goods, services, and investment. facilitated movement of business persons, professionals, talents, and labor, and freer flow of capital. Under the ASEAN Charter, ASEAN also aims to alleviate poverty and narrow the development gap within ASEAN through mutual assistance and cooperation. To accelerate ASEAN transformation into an economically stable region, ASEAN leaders agreed at the 12th ASEAN Summit in 2007 to the Cebu Declaration on acceleration of the establishment of an ASEAN community by 2015. At the end of 2015, ASEAN will turn into what is to be known as the ASEAN Community, which has three pillars as already mentioned, namely the ASEAN Security Community, now the ASEAN Political Security Community, the ASEAN Economic Community, and the ASEAN Social Cultural Community. The ASEAN Political Security Community aims towards enhancing peace, stability, democracy, and prosperity in the region through comprehensive political and security cooperation. The ASEAN Economic Community aims towards enhancing competitiveness for economic growth and development through closer economic integration. The ASEAN Social Cultural Community aims towards nurturing human, cultural, and natural resources for sustained development in a harmonious and people-centered ASEAN. During the 26th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, ASEAN leaders issued the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on a people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN in 2015. In ensuring the success of the ASEAN Economic Community, ASEAN leaders agree to promote an integrated, stable, prosperous, and highly cohesive regional economy which encompasses all sectors of society, as well as encourage the participation of women, the elderly, and youth in building a competitive, innovative, and dynamic ASEAN. ASEAN leaders also agreed to promote the development of small and medium enterprises as a driving force for the AEC, including providing an enabling environment conducive to their businesses, access to the formal financial system, and continue promoting public-private sector partnership. The leaders also agree to encourage more engagement and interaction between ASEAN and business leaders, including small and medium enterprises, support the initiative for ASEAN Integration Work Plan and its successor documents to narrow the development gaps among ASEAN member states, as well as to facilitate movement of business persons, skilled labor, and talents. ASEAN leaders celebrated the formal establishment of the ASEAN Community 2015 and to chart ASEAN Community Vision 2025 by issuing the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on ASEAN 2025, Forging Ahead Together, at the 27th ASEAN Summit. ASEAN leaders adopt the ASEAN Community and further launches the ASEAN Community Vision 2025, the ASEAN Political Security Community Blueprint 2025, the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025, and the ASEAN Social Cultural Community Blueprint 2025. ASEAN leaders agree that ASEAN 2025 Forging Ahead Together succeeds the roadmap for an ASEAN Community 2009 to 2015. Through the ASEAN 2025 Forging Ahead Together, ASEAN leaders resolve to consolidate ASEAN Community by building upon and deepening the integration process to realize a rule-based, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN Community with human rights and fundamental freedoms, higher quality of life, and the benefits of community building, reinforcing sense of togetherness and common identity, guided by the purposes and principles of the ASEAN Charter. ASEAN leaders also envision a peaceful, stable, and resilient economic ASEAN community with enhanced capacity to respond effectively to challenges, and ASEAN as an outward-looking region within a global community of nations while maintaining ASEAN centrality. ASEAN leaders also underline the importance and complementarity of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goal, or generally known as the SDG, with ASEAN community building efforts to uplift the standards of living of ASEAN people.